My guest today is Professor Rodrigo Braga, who's Assistant Professor of Neurology at Northwestern University. His research interests include brain networks, cognitive neuroscience, and neurodegenerative diseases. Welcome, Rodrigo.
Thank you, Gill. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I got a couple of your recent and very interesting papers. As I mentioned, I don't have a lot of background in this, but I found this topics really interesting. So I want to start with the human social cognitive network contains multiple regions within the amygdala. And you say here reasoning about someone's thoughts and intentions, forming a theory of mind, is a core aspect of social cognition and relies on association areas of the brain that have expanded disproportionately, you say, in the human lineage. Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit. We recently showed that these association zones comprise parallel distributed networks that, despite occupying adjacent and interdigitated regions, serve dissociable functions. Yeah, so let me start a little bit of a tangent here, Rodrigo. So I often hear this, the human is so great, has, the brain is so, some say it's the most complicated thing in the universe. And we don't even know the universe. We don't even know what's out there. So that is a false statement to start with. I don't have a dog or a cat, but I've seen some dog videos. I suspect they have a theory of mind as
Mm.
well. I mean, I've seen, animals interact with each other. So is this really special to humans?
Well, no, I think, you've touched on an interesting topic. I don't think it's unique in the sense that, other animals will not show any evidence of this. I think there's good evidence that animals do have a sense of what others might be doing or planning to do. And so I think of those, uniquely human abilities as maybe more advanced is a word I'm more comfortable with.
Yeah.
And language is a good example of that. Animals communicate, and we're very certain of that. And there's some cool research coming out about animals using specific words for specific contexts. But humans clearly have a more advanced way of structuring language and communicating very specific concepts to each other, which
Mm.
I think it's fair to say we don't see that level of precision in the animal kingdom. And so I think for this social cognitive
Yeah.
function, it's a similar thing where we can be very precise and yeah, we have an enhanced capacity, if you will, to do that.
Enhanced capacity. So I understand the language part of it, but going back to the theory of mind question. So if I understand this correctly, Rodrigo, the theory of mind is that a one biological entity, whether it's a human or a mammal or something, can put him or her on somebody else's mind, so to speak, or
Mm.
somebody else's shoes, more more contemporarily, as we say, and understand what that person is feeling, thinking, might be doing, those types of things, right? So is that what we call theory of mind?
Yeah, and I mean, you can't know what someone else is thinking, but you can form a hypothesis. You can imagine what you would feel if you were in that person's shoes, to use your phrasing, and
Yeah.
and then you can build hypotheses. You can build a story about what that person will do, won't do, all based on this model that you have. And so,
Mm.
it's very interesting to think about how we emerge that ability to have that ability, because it's easy to think about knowing your own feeling to a certain situation, and then
Mm.
thinking, well, if that had happened to me, I would feel X. But then you're
Mm.
able to shift that and think, well, this person's different. I know from past experience that this person reacts in this way. Um, yeah, I think those are really interesting questions, and you can understand why that would be really evolutionarily um,
Advantages, yeah.
advantageous, to be able
Yeah.
to. I think of, in a ape family, and you have the alpha who's looking pretty annoyed and
Mhm.
angry. It's like, okay, I probably should avoid this, the alpha in this situation. But yeah, you can think of other examples like that where it would be really advantageous.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is in your research, Rodrigo, but I want to ask you, so if you sort of look at the spectrum, high empathy and low empathy, let's say, some kind of spectrum like that, are we classifying people? So are we I was sort of putting people into a bucket, saying, okay, so I look into this person's eyes. I think this person is pretty empathetic. And so now I can take that as an initial condition and go into some predictions on that person. So are we customizing on the individual, or are we sort of classifying the individual into a few buckets?
Well, my research doesn't really speak to that too much. We don't look at individual differences in this social cognitive network to, to make any claims about the level of empathy of someone. So we have to take a step back and just say, humans can do this ability of imagining what is in someone else's mind. And there are lots of, other labs have been studying this for decades. And what they show is that when you have someone in the scan and you ask them in an MRI scanner, you ask them to do this kind of task, imagine what
Yeah.
this person's feeling. You have this widespread activity in multiple brain regions that increases when they do this type of thinking. And so we really wanted to study that network of brain regions. Is there something about that network that helps us understand how it has this role in a social form of thinking? And that was really our focus. It's more of an anatomical investigation, or is there anything about this network that gives us a clue as to how it can perform this function?
Yeah, so let's talk about the hardware a little bit. So what exactly is the amygdala? What does it do?
Uh, yeah, great question. The amygdala is a really important structure. The classic studies talk about fear conditioning, and so that's where the Pavlovian learning, where you pair a sound with a response. And in that case, it's the sound of a bell, leading to association with food and the dog salivating. There are also lots of studies that show you can do a fear learning an experiment where you pair a sound with something like a foot shock, and so the sound is paired with an aversive
That's what
stimulus.
they call signal seeking, as opposed to goal seeking or something like that.
No, I'm not sure what.
That's
Yeah,
different. Okay.
I
Yeah.
think that's different. Yeah. Basically, the reason I brought that up is because the amygdala is very important for that kind of learning. And so, you know, you need the amygdala to pair something that happens in the world with an outcome. In this case, that sound means I'm going to get shocked. Uh,
Yeah.
and so it's important for fear, but it's also important for a lot of different emotional behaviors. Um, there are parts of the amygdala that control parenting, aggression, mating behaviors. In humans that were born and had a brain lesion that affected their amygdala, they'll have difficulties in processing emotions and faces, for instance. The amygdala is doing some kind of orienting to important things in the environment, um, but also in terms of learning and an expression of emotions following these experiences. So it's a very ancient and very important structure for those things.
And it's very specialized structure. So do we have any data on if you go back to other mammals and go further back? Um, when do we first encounter the amygdala-like structure in biological systems?
Yeah, so the term lizard brain is often thrown around for the amygdala, and the reason people use that term is because if you look at the brains of reptiles that are alive today, they have a structure that's not completely equivalent, but it's very similar to the amygdala. And that implies that the common ancestor that we have with lizards also had this amygdala-like structure. Now, I feel like I want to Google this now, but you can estimate the age of the common ancestor, and I think it's around 400 million years.
400 million
Maybe
years. Yeah, yeah.
maybe I can Google this and you can.
No, no. So,
Uh,
so I mean, if we find commonality in the lizard brain, I mean that is going a lot further back. So it
yes,
is sort of fundamental in the evolutionary process. And obviously, mammals and humans would have had much higher specialization in it. But it seems like a very, very important sort of decision center almost, right, in the brain.
I would say so. Yes, it's learning about the environment, what things are aversive, what things are uh, appetitive, and it's helping you to behave according to those experiences.
And it's pretty small in the grand scheme of things, if I understand this correctly, right? Is it?
Yes, I mean, compared to the size of the human brain, it is quite a small structure. It's interesting that there are parts of the amygdala that have grown in proportion to how much the cerebral cortex has grown, which shows you a clue that the amygdala is processing the information from the cerebral cortex, and that ties in really nicely with the results that we saw.
Right. So it's a bit like us. I mean, I don't want to make too many computer analogies here, but it's a bit like CPU in the sense that there's a lot of processing going on there, and there's sort of data being, sort of shuttled into it from the brain. And I know that you do a lot of work in the neurodegenerative diseases. So what we find, sort of issues with the amygdala or loss of it or some injury to it, how does it surface yeah, in the human being?
How does what surface?
Some sort of bad thing happening to the amygdala, whether it's a disease or some parts are lost or something like that, or even completely lost in the
Yeah,
brain.
I mean, it's definitely beyond my expertise, I'm not sure if we have a good sense of what things developmentally will affect the function of the amygdala for things like anxiety, and there's some link to autism. I think schizophrenia as well is one where
Yeah.
they've all been linked to amygdala, abnormal function of the amygdala. I'm not sure, I'm speaking beyond my knowledge here. I don't think that we know exactly what those factors are. You
Yeah,
can
so
get
just talk about
things.
this circuit in the paper. So you say here what circuit properties differentiate parallel networks. You say here we show that social cognitive association areas are intrinsically and selectively connected to anterior regions of the medial temporal lobe that are implicated in emotional learning and social behaviors, including the amygdala at or near the basolateral complex and medial nucleus. And so this is obviously not a thing that is sitting separate from the rest of the brain. It is
Mhm.
taking a lot of data in and it's processing some of the data and pushing some of that back, I would imagine, to make decisions elsewhere in the brain. And so what do we know about these neural circuits? Yeah, talk about some of the experiments that you've been doing, and how do you study these networks?
So maybe I can first talk you through a bit of the circuitry and then talk about the experiments themselves. So
Yeah.
the you're completely right that the amygdala is connected to the brain, and so is it surprising that this network is connected to the brain? Um, I think what's cool about the result is that we see multiple regions of the social cognitive network within the amygdala, but
Mm,
those amygdala regions are across multiple parts of the amygdala, and the amygdala has this very interesting wiring, which
mm,
we know a lot about from past studies. And so one is a basolateral complex,
yeah.
and that receives input from multiple cortical areas. So that's perhaps less surprising that we see a region of the network there.
Mm,
But what was cool is that we also saw a region within the medial nucleus. Now, that
mm,
is a really interesting structure because it controls social behaviors in rodents, in non-human primates.
mm,
Um, Different cell types will control parenting, mating, aggression, and we saw a region of the social cognitive network that overlapped with this medial nucleus. And that specificity, I think, is really interesting because the social cognitive network specifically is interacting with the medial nucleus, and that implies that the functions of the medial nucleus are coloring the functions of this much wider brain network that includes multiple brain regions and is in this parts of the brain that are really expanded in our recent evolution. So that's, I think, where it's
So
cool because it's the specificity.
so sorry to interrupt. So is the
Yeah,
medial nucleus sort of adjacent to the amygdala, or is it part of it?
it's part of the amygdala, but it
Okay.
serves. I talked about the basolateral complex being an input from the cortex. The medial nucleus is often thought as one of the main outputs of the amygdala, and that output
Oh,
goes to things like the hypothalamus, which controls, your autonomic physiological responses. And
mm.
that's a really interesting wiring because you have input from the cortex going to the medial nucleus. Presumably that's involved in learning and expressing emotional responses to what you're experiencing.
Mm. Yeah, so the important thing here in the paper, you say here the results suggest that social cognitive functions emerge through coordinated activity between internal circuits of the amygdala and the broader distributed association network, and indicate that medial nucleus may play an important role in social cognition in humans. Yeah, social cognition is such a complex thing.
Mm.
It is incredible. This little thing that we carry on top of our shoulders actually do all of this stuff. Um, and so what? If I understand this correctly, Rodrigo, I actually don't know much about this. When you study this, a lot of areas are sort of firing up in the brain, amygdala being sort of at the center of it, right? Is that the way to understand it?
Exactly. When you're engaging in that kind of thought about other people, you have multiple parts of the brain activating, and this part of the amygdala, those specific parts, the medial nucleus, basolateral complex, are also activating alongside that network.
Yeah, so I remember reading something that so amygdala is sort of deep in there, so we cannot really excite it.
Mm.
But part of your work is, sort of if we can figure out how it's connected to the top of the brain, maybe we can do some transcranial magnetic excitation in
Mhm.
other parts of the brain, and then look at what might transpire in the amygdala, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, there's a lot of very cool work right now in terms of how can you modulate brain networks? Can that give you therapeutic effects? And one idea is that if you can understand the network of brain regions that are connected, you can modulate any part of that network and therefore enact a network level effect. Now, why is that interesting? Well, some parts of the network may be very deep in the brain. They may be subcortical and hard to reach with stimulation. But if that network has a more peripheral, more surface level region, you might be able to reach that region and affect the whole network. And this is one example. We don't do TMS, we don't do any studies with that particular modality. We're not studying that directly, but our work implies that you could modulate those amygdala nuclei by interacting with the more peripheral surface regions of this social cognitive network. And I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, so the outside part is sort of the input, and the medial nucleus, you said, is sort of the output. So um, medial nucleus is also part of amygdala, so it's sort of in there. So we cannot really touch that either, right? I
Yeah, so
mean, from yeah, yeah.
no, just to clarify, I, I, I don't think that the cortical parts are inputs, and so it's just that I just meant within the amygdala, the basolateral complex is receiving input from the cortex, but it's I don't know the directionality of that, whether that's a bilateral relationship.
Oh.
But yes, exactly. So you're asking if we can modulate the medial nucleus itself. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that's what I was asking. But that is also not reachable by transcranial excitation, I would imagine, right?
Right, exactly. It's very deep in the brain. You could reach it by intracranial stimulation, where you actually have to do surgery and go right into the brain. And there are some cool labs doing that, where you place an electrode within the amygdala and then you can apply stimulation. It's called deep brain stimulation. It's used for Parkinson's very famously. There's testing about whether it's useful for depression, but that's another way to reach it. It's just an invasive procedure, so it's not, it's very rare an occasion when you do that.
Yeah, so I always felt, Rodrigo, so there's this electromagnetic chemical system, and
Mm.
the further up you go in the human body, it becomes more electromagnetic than chemical. But all of life sciences today is about chemical interventions,
Mm.
and we had a checkered history, I would argue, with chemical interventions of the CNS system. And so this appears to be a really potentially a profitable path for us to pursue, right?
Yeah, I think I would push back that it's all chemical. There are even behavioral interventions can have a big effect, in terms, especially if you're thinking about quality of life for a patient. You know, why not explore all the possibilities? I think the lifestyle changes can have a big effect in, for example, Alzheimer's and dementia. Having someone exercise is one of the big factors for prevention. But you're absolutely right. why not explore whether electrical stimulation can have an effect? There is enough evidence, I think, that modulating brain circuits can have an effect that it's worth additional research.
So when you think about stimulation therapy, are we thinking about sort of longitudinally? So you mentioned Alzheimer's. I wondered, so suppose, we do the DNA test, and I'm just making this up, Rodrigo. I
Hmm.
haven't thought about this at all. And you say there's a higher probability this individual will develop Alzheimer's, let's say.
Hmm.
Can we early intervene and and perhaps have a continuous sequence of stimulations or something like that? Is that possible?
Yeah, in the case of Alzheimer's, I don't know of any specific brain stimulation therapies that are currently in use. That some of the Alzheimer's treatments are symptomatic in terms of improving attention and memory without really modifying the disease progression. And you could imagine that being the case. There are some studies with TMS improving memory. Yeah, if that's what you mean, that's an
Yeah,
exciting
yeah.
prospect. I think it definitely needs more research right now.
Yeah, so I mean, because it's not invasive,
Mhm.
there are better ways to sort of experiment with it a little bit, right? So when you do the transcranial stimulation, do we know? Well, I mean, this is a very complicated thing. I mean, there might be some negative effects there too, right? I mean, we have to still look at that as well.
Yes, I think so. I mean, you know, it's uncomfortable. It can cause a little bit of pain while you're applying stimulation.
Oh,
There is the
okay.
fear of inducing seizures, and so you have to be very careful to do it within safety limits. And you know, there is a whole procedure for working those out. And
Mhm.
if done, carefully enough, I think it's a relatively safe technique that is quite widely used. TMS is quite widely used, both in research and in clinical contexts.
So at Northwestern, you're sort of taking a more detailed picture of the brain to look at the activities, I understand. So is this fMRI? What is the right technology for that?
Yeah, we use fMRI, which stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging. And the innovation that my lab focuses on is the ability to map brain networks within individuals. And so this is something that in my field historically, because fMRI is a relatively low signal to noise ratio technique, that just
Mm,
means the measurements are really noisy. Um, what we've done to counteract that is we've said, well, why don't we scan lots of people and then we have lots of data, we can average across those people and get a more reliable map of their brain. And that's been we've done decades of research on that. It's been a really great engine for discovery. However, there was always this problem that, our brains are very different in terms of where the anatomical folds are and even where the functional regions are within those anatomical folds. And so we're
mm,
always aware of this problem. And more recently in the network mapping field, which is my field, we focused on getting enough data from within each individual to be able to map that person's brain, the networks within that
mm,
person's brain. And so what that looks like is it seems like a resolution jump because you can see a much more detailed architecture of brain networks when you look within
mm,
individuals than when you're averaging across people. And that has allowed us to gain insights into how specific networks are wired and how that wiring may result in cognition. In the
mm.
in the paper that you mentioned, the amygdala paper, the social cognitive paper, we did that
Yeah.
with an individual mapping, but we also used 7 Tesla high field fMRI, which allows you to make even smaller pixels. We call them voxels, they're
Mm,
3D pixels, but you can basically make a
mhm,
high resolution map of the brain, which not only is within individuals, so it's detailed because of that, but it's also high resolution. And we think that that's why we were able to see these amygdala regions and differentiate different regions within the amygdala, which, as you said, is a very small structure,
mm.
because we had the high resolution within individuals.
Yeah, so this data might be quite amenable to machine learning, I would think, right? So both in a sort of an unsupervised sense, I got all these patterns of various individuals. Do we find some sort of commonality in those patterns? But even in a label sense, if I know this individual has some sort of disease state, for instance, I can maybe go back and ask, what patterns appear to be more dominant in that
Mm.
disease state, right? So that data should be quite interesting for a machine learning perspective, I would think.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons this data set was collected. We used a natural scenes data set, which was spearheaded by Kendrick Kay at the University of Minnesota, who's an author on this paper. And I think that's why, he collected lots and lots of data from the same person, so you could do these kinds of
Mm,
approaches. It was focused on the visual processing hierarchy and more visual processing. Um, that one of the issues is that it requires so much effort within each individual. It's
mm,
multiple, sometimes 20, 30 sessions of scanning for each person. And so
mm,
you trade off, the trade-off is you can only do 8 people or, very few numbers. And so that makes it difficult for the kind of analysis you suggested, where you're trying to say what's normal across people, and then how does this person vary? Because you only have 8 people, so you can't really get a good sense of what normal is. Any
yeah.
differences within your individual might be because of just who they are. So that's difficult. What we really need is, thousands of people, all with the individualized mapping. And right now the field
Yeah.
is, there are some really exciting data sets out there where they have
Mm,
thousands of individuals, and typically the imaging has been restricted to only a few um, runs. So, within the scope
mm.
of about an hour of data or so. And so what we really need is lots and lots of data from lots and lots of individuals.
Yeah, you need an app for it. You need to put that into the Apple Watch or something like that, so that
Right.
people can go measure it and then send you the data.
Mm.
But also, it's quite interesting longitudinally, right? So if you can follow one individual over time,
Hmm.
how do these patterns change over time in that individual's life? I mean, you're obviously starting off now, but that could also be an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, 100%. I think you mentioned autism at some point, and that's an interesting, you know, case because it happens over development. So something's happening, some deviation from typical neurotypical is happening over development. And so if you could track over time many individuals, some of which have autism spectrum disorder, there may be some very interesting changes that you can track, and that might help you to focus therapies or interventions on specific time windows during development. Um,
Yeah.
Obviously, you can also do that behaviorally, but there might be other approaches that emerge from that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm making this up, Rodrigo, but if you get a lot of data, they could have some diagnostic properties too. So,
Hmm.
early childhood, if I see a pattern that I can now predict is going to develop in this fashion, then perhaps I could use it diagnostically as well, very early in a person's life, potentially.
I think so. And the cool thing is, it doesn't have to be the only test. If you have any brain imaging based indication, you can say to someone, go and do further testing for, whatever it is, whatever condition it is. It can just be one tool in the doctor's arsenal for helping patients.
Yeah. Excellent. So I want to go into another very interesting paper, Rodrigo. So distinct distributed brain networks dissociate self-generated mental states. So you say here, human cognition relies on two modes: a perceptually coupled mode, where mental states are driven by sensory input, and a perceptually decoupled mode, featuring self-generated mental content. You say here, past work suggests that imagined states are supported by the reinstatement of activity in sensory cortex, but transmodal systems within the canonical default network are also implicated in mind wandering, recollection, and imagining the future. Yeah. So as reading through your abstract, I was wondering, so let start a little bit of a tangent and we'll come back to the details of the paper. So mind wandering, ADHD has potentially high correlation with ASD. Recollection it has been known that many of our scientists are potentially on the right side of the autism spectrum disorder, and we can recollect almost photographic memory and imagining the future. Imagination is also sort of a ground truth for innovation and all of that. And so these features that you find in the default network, mind-wandering, recollection, and imagining the future, do we find any correlations of that to any disease state or anything like that?
Yes, yes. In short, yes. I mean, one thing that in Alzheimer's disease, for instance, one of the first parts of the cortex that gets affected is a core region of the default network. It's also been associated with many different conditions. Autism is another one, that's been implicated in this network. And I think that speaks to one of the things that my work has helped with, is that the canonical default network, and by that we just mean the historically defined default network, is a really large set of regions. And lots of work has emerged more recently showing that there is meaningful subdivisions within this canonical default network that have different specializations. And so one of these networks, these sub-specializations of the default network, is the social cognitive network that we talked about just now. The other one is a network that seems to be more important for mental scene construction, as you would use when remembering the past. You would think about a specific location, an event happening in space, but also imagining the future is very similar in that sense. You might imagine a specific context and what you might do in that specific location. And so this paper and others that have recently come out have suggested that this part of the default network, we call it default network A, which is very unimaginative, but you can also think of it as a scene construction network. It seems to be important for that type of thinking.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is in your research, Rodrigo. So we know that sleep, for example, is very important for memory consolidation. And I think there are mice models and models that show that when they sleep, they're sort of replaying whatever data was collected or whatever experiences were collected during daytime. So this replaying that the brain is doing, is it sort of in the similar area? I wonder.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, so the replay and pre-play is a really interesting phenomenon where you'll see activity in typically the hippocampus, medial temporal lobe, which will happen in the same sequences as it does when an animal is exploring an environment. And that implies that usually it happens when the animal stops and isn't moving. Implies that when they stop, they're like thinking about what they just did or what they're about to do. That's why it's called replay or pre-play.
Yeah.
What's interesting about the default network is that if you look at its organization, it includes multiple brain regions. Again, it's within the expanded parts of the human brain. That's one thing that's interesting about it. But it includes a region in the medial temporal lobe, very prominent in the parahippocampal cortex, which just besides the hippocampus. But evidence that it's also connected to the full hippocampal circuitry, which includes the hippocampus and also adjacent structures. And so one interesting idea is that that's why the default network is active when you're imagining the future, the past, mentally constructing scenes. Maybe it's active because it has this link to the hippocampus, which has this pre-play and replay phenomena.
And there's a lot of data. And so to imagine, you need a lot of data in some sense. So it's sort of storing things, and you can go there and collect some. It's like going to a library or something. I'm just making this up. So I'm going to pick a few books, and then I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to sort of imagine how things could be. And so you have some experiments here. So you say participants imagine different scenarios in the scanner. This is the fMRI scanner.
That's right. Yeah.
And you say here, then rated their mental states on several properties using multidimensional experience sampling. So talk a little bit about the experiment that you ran there.
Yeah, so we wanted to study this phenomenon. We're able to imagine all kinds of things. Like we talked about future past, but you can imagine something you did. You can imagine someone's voice. You can imagine a song in your head. You can imagine someone's face. You can imagine, many different things. It's a very flexible space. And so we were interested in, are there certain parts of the brain that are involved in all these different types of imagining, or is there any specialization within the domain of imagining? So what we did is we had people lay in the scanner, and we devised all these prompts or cues. So one of them might be in a car on a hill. The participant would spend about 7 seconds just thinking about that to themselves, and then they would respond to questions about what they imagined. So in the scanner, time is very limited, and so we just asked them two questions. How much did you experience mental images? So you were seeing things in your mind's eye, and they rated that between 1 and 4. And then we also asked them, how much were you hearing sounds in your head related to what you were imagining? And they rated that between 1 and 4. And so, it's somewhat, it's not really enough to just ask them these two questions about something so rich as what they're imagining. And so as soon as they came out of the scanner, we had them sit down on a computer and just answer multiple questions. Were you thinking about things happening over time? Were you thinking about locations of things in space? Were you thinking about other people? Was it about the future or past? Were you using your past memory to imagine? So because of this approach, we were able to ask them many, many more questions outside of the scanner about what they had imagined in the scanner. And that allowed us to get a richer sense of what they were imagining, and then we were able to relate those responses to their brain activity.
I don't know if I understand this correctly, Rodrigo. So the video, I don't know, it's videos, it's visual things are different from the auditory part of it. So did you find sort of two different networks, one specializing on the visual part and one specializing in the audio part, auditory part, I should say?
That is, we found evidence consistent with that. You have to keep in mind that the specific questions that we asked them, were, some of them were visual and spatial, and others were about language. So we were interested in inner speech, which is, if you ever are thinking to yourself and you can feel like you're hearing your own voice in your head and your thoughts are organized in terms of an internal voice, we were interested in those two phenomena. And I think the latter, the inner speech, is much more associated with hearing, so inner hearing. Whereas when you're thinking about a scene, like imagining a castle on a hill, then it's much more of a visual and spatial phenomenon. So yes, when you ask people to do these types of imagining, the auditory imagery is much more related to the inner speech, as you might expect.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I don't know, if I remember correctly, language is, well, this is up for debate, obviously. Language is on the left side of the brain, and the auditory part is not on the left side, right? Is it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, you're not wrong. So the auditory cortex is bilateral. You have one on each temporal lobe. Language is one of the cognitive functions that is thought to be most lateralized. And so most people, I think it's 90%, will have a left lateralized language network. And then it gets tricky because language itself is a very broad term, and you need to, if you're listening to someone, you need auditory input to comprehend them. So is that part of the language network or not? But there is, the way that we think about it is that there is a core set of brain regions, a core language network, which responds to language across different senses. So whether you're listening to someone, whether you're reading words, the same network activates when you're engaging with stimuli that have a linguistic meaning. But that network is left lateralized, as you said, in most people.
It's lateral. So this is not new research, but I just want to get a quick perspective on this. So when somebody picks up a second language, is he or she using sort of the other side of the lateral specialization, or how does it work?
I don't think so. Yeah, it's beyond. I haven't studied language and new language learning. I don't think so. I think you use the same set of regions. You may, for instance, need networks that are involved in attentional control to focus more because it's more difficult. We process language very automatically. And so I could imagine you engaging other networks, some of which are more right lateralized or bilateral when you're trying to learn a new language. But I think, think of it as you have this machinery in the brain that already likes linking certain sounds or certain squiggles on a page, so text with meaning. You already have the circuitry that does that, and so it would make sense that you'd use the same circuitry for a new language. You just are learning new words, right?
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to look at the cultural aspects of this. I don't know if you find that interesting. As I wondered, people from different cultures, or it could be as simple as people who are very multilingual and people who just know one language, whether they imagine things differently. I wondered. Do you think? Do you expect a difference in how they think?
I mean, so I speak Portuguese, and when I go back to Brazil, after a few days I start dreaming in Portuguese, and that's always very noticeable. I hear many people talk about that, how interesting it is. I finally dreamt in this language. So that's definitely a phenomenon. I'm not sure I understood the question. Do you mean, are you using different brain networks, or is that a thing that happens?
No. I was wondering, when you put a multilingual person on the scanner, not just multilingual, but that person speaks many, many different languages or whatever, right? Or some sort of cultural diversity that is multifactorial. You
Yeah.
put that person on the scanner, that person's brain doesn't look different from somebody who just grew up in one country, spoke one language, all of that stuff.
Yeah, they do say that there are benefits to learning a second language. I've heard that colloquially before. We haven't studied this directly. I would point you to the
Yeah.
work of Ev Fedorenko, who's at MIT, who's studied this. And in particular, she studied some hyperpolyglots who know, I don't know the official definition, but it's like 10 languages or something, or more.
Yes.
And so then it's interesting. So we all have a language network, but this person speaks 2 languages, 10 languages. Would you expect the language network to be bigger or smaller, right? Logically, maybe bigger because there's more of the brain devoted to doing that, to learning those multiple languages. But again, you should speak with Ev Fedorenko about this. But as I understand it, actually it was the opposite. These people activate very small regions where the language network should be when they're engaging in languages. I think especially if they know the language very well, they're using very little, they're using less brain power to do that. So it's more complex than the sort of initial thinking, but it's also interesting to think that, it's so efficient. Maybe one way that they can learn so many languages is by making their language network more efficient for encoding different words in the multiple languages.
Yeah, that makes a lot of intuitive sense to me, actually. Yeah. And so I want to sort of finish up with the paper here. So the last part of this abstract, you say here the results suggest that different association networks support imagined states that are high in visual or auditory vividness, and that makes a lot of sense. And so I want to take a quick detour into uh, what is now called artificial intelligence. I call it advanced automation. And the reason I do that is because I think the technology axis progression we have on artificial intelligence is not really going to get us to intelligence per se, because I mean all your research is indicating that the processes are quite different here. It's not like just throw a lot more dollars and a lot more silicon on the problem. So we have a very efficient instrument that seems to be doing things very differently. So based on all your research, what is your sense of the technology angle that we are pursuing in AI? Is that going to be profitable?
Well, definitely profitable, yes. I think that's what you're asking. If I was an investor, I'd say yes. I think you're asking about, is it really intelligent in the
Yes.
sense that we think of humans being intelligent? I think that intelligence, even in biological creatures is hard to define, first of all. Does AI show evidence of intelligence? I would say I think it's very clear that it does if you just have a conversation with, one of these LLMs, that they will respond to specifics of what you say. They'll give you ideas if you ask them to generate ideas, So I think in many ways, yes, I would say passes the criteria for intelligence. I think there's a difference between how we think of our minds, and that's something that I think is really interesting. We're studying mental imagery here. This very strange process where you're not responding to sensory input, you're just creating it in your mind. No one else has access to it. It's just you. You're using it flexibly. You're using it to maybe plan a holiday, maybe work out a solution to a problem. Clearly, it has a lot of uses for us. And the big question is, does AI have this same phenomenon? Does it experience things outside of what it's outputting, its behavior? And there, I think it's interesting to think about brain networks because, like this paper is showing that there are specifics of the brain circuits that are being activated when you're engaging in mental imagery. And we're trying to understand that better. Is it a sensory reactivation, or is it one of these transmodal higher order networks that are linked to the hippocampus that are involved in creating mental imagery? And so for that, I think the human brain literature can really inform it, because if you construct an AI that has the same circuit properties as humans, as much as that's possible, then presumably you get to more human-like types of thinking, and potentially things like mental imagery could become a reality if it's using the same types of wiring. Now, whether that's really in our interest, in the AI's interest, probably not. Like you're saying, advanced automation doesn't need to have that kind of wiring. It's not necessarily the case that wiring is the best use, the best way to achieve that goal. It's just that for us, we have these evolved biological brains that, like started with a lizard, and then we're slowly progressing and changing that lizard brain. And so the way that we do things is very different to how an AI might do things, and that's okay.
So what's missing? What's missing might be in silicon. What might be missing is imagination. And so, what your work is showing is that, I mean, it does some sort of basic processing to get to sort of a goal. But then it digs into it. It's doing a bunch of other stuff. It may not be completely efficient from a computational perspective. We don't understand it, obviously. We don't have anything like that in silicon currently, right? So we are always sort of goal seeking, just predict the probability of the next word coming out of the LLM. That is a pretty easy thing to do, but the LLM is not sitting there imagining a vacation or something like that yet. So that might be what's missing.
But it's crazy how the types of intelligent behaviors that come out of just the simple process that you're saying, just predict the next word, and yet somehow you can have a complete conversation with it that's very enlightening in some ways. But yes, I agree. I think right now LLMs are designed for that specific role. And so can we design a different type of AI that incorporates some of these properties? What would that mean? Even if it tells us that it's imagining its next holiday, will we just say that that's it's trying to dupe us into passing the Turing test? I'm not sure. It's pretty funny to think.
I mean, just thinking aloud here, Rodrigo. So it should be do I get to answers. But if you're sitting idle and you have all this data, it should be the age of that process could be quite low because you don't get anything out of it. But potentially for us to get to what is now AI, but I don't think we're close to it yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's once you start feeding its own output to itself and have it engage with thinking about problems, generative input, and everything that in, and that's in the imagery or in a speech. So it is interesting to think, just have a small modification where you just feed, an LLM its own inputs and see where it takes it in terms of the functions that it provides. I mean, it raises this other question of, in our test, we ask people, what were you thinking about? And we just have a belief that they are being truthful, but also that they are actually experiencing the types of thinking that they tell us that they are. But, they're very hard to measure these things. You can ask it. I've never done it, but you could ask an LLM, what are you thinking about, and see what it says.
Yeah. Sort of an audit function.
Right.
To sort of look to peek into the process. Yeah, but I think we are too far away from artificial intelligence yet, and so yeah, this is fascinating research, Rodrigo. I hope you continue on this. I mean, there's a lot of therapeutic possibilities, diagnostic possibilities, and it helps us understand us better in a more systematic way, I think.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for spending time with me. Thank you.
Thank you.